In a world where the roar of sirens often filled my days, I found solace in the gentle rhythms of farming. By day, I donned my badge, navigating the complexities of crime and justice as a government detective. My career involved deciphering intricate puzzles, whether it was investigating fraud rings or tracking down elusive suspects. Each case pulled me deeper into a web of deception, but it was my weekends at the barn that truly anchored me. Nestled on the outskirts of town, my property was more than just a piece of land. It was a sanctuary where I could escape the relentless pace of urban life. The barn, weathered yet sturdy, housed not only tools and feed, but also my beloved animals, each with its own personality. There was Daisy, the stubborn goat who never missed a chance to nibble on my hat, and Buster, my loyal sheepdog, ever watchful and ready to herd anything that dared stray too close to our little farm. Mornings often began with the sun casting a warm glow over the fields, a stark contrast to the cold steel of the city. I would spend hours tending to my crops and caring for my animals, relishing the connection to nature that seemed increasingly rare in my professional life. It was this duality, detective by week, farmer by weekend, that shaped my identity. Yet beneath this peaceful facade lay an undercurrent of tension with the homeowners association. Their increasing scrutiny and strict regulations over every aspect of life in our community began to suffocate my passion for farming. Little did I know, this tension would soon erupt in a way I never could have anticipated, turning my tranquil haven into a battleground of justice that would test every facet of my character. As my weekends unfolded in the familiar embrace of my farm, the shadows of tension loomed closer with each passing day. The Homeowners Association, once viewed as a benign oversight group, transformed into a source of constant stress. Their strict regulations, designed to maintain property values and community aesthetics, began to feel more like shackles than guidelines. What was once a simple joy of farming became a battleground of compliance. It all began innocently enough. A letter about my barn needing a fresh coat of paint. Then came the complaints about my unkempt landscaping, supposedly too wild for the HOA's preferred look. It felt absurd. My barn, rustic and well-loved, held character and memories. Yet, in the eyes of the members, it represented a breach of their meticulously curated standards. Meetings grew increasingly confrontational as I pushed back against their demands. During a particularly heated session, I stood my ground against a board member who questioned the appropriateness of my garden's layout. Nature doesn't conform to your rules, I argued, my voice rising above the murmurs of disapproval. The disdain in their eyes was palpable. I could sense a deepening animosity brewing beneath their polished facades. As I continued to resist their regulatory overreach, my fellow farmers in the community seemed to either cower under the HOA's pressure or align with them, fearing that any association with someone so openly defiant might jeopardize their own standing. The isolation was suffocating, turning weekly meetings into incidents filled with passive-aggressive comments and hushed whispers. I realized that what started as a disagreement over mere bylaws had morphed into something far more personal, an all-out war over my right to live authentically. Little did I know that this escalating conflict would soon spiral into chaos, revealing the true nature of their intentions and provoking a response I never imagined possible. The day began like any other. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light across my property as I prepared for a morning of tending to my beloved animals. However, beneath that serene surface, an unease simmered. I sensed it in the air, thick with tension. My suspicions were confirmed when I heard the distant roar of machinery and voices rising in agitation. As I approached my barn, I stumbled upon a scene that felt like a surreal nightmare. A small group from the HOA stood defiantly outside, armed with equipment that could only be described as menacing, a flamethrower. Their leader, always so prim and polished, now wore an expression of righteous aggression as he gestured toward my barn and shouted something about enforcing compliance with community standards. I stood frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. "You can't be serious," I yelled, trying to sound authoritative despite my shock. But my protest fell on deaf ears. The flame ignited with a terrifying whoosh, a jet of fire scorching toward the weathered wood of my beloved barn. Chaos erupted as my animals panicked, bleating and barking in confusion at the flames licking their home. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air, and I felt adrenaline surge through me as I sprinted forward, desperate to stop what felt like an unspeakable act of violence against not just my property but everything I held dear. Despite my frantic attempts to intervene, the flames roared higher, fueled by shock and rage that coursed through me. As neighbors gathered to witness this insanity, I could see expressions of disbelief mirrored in their faces. The sight of my sanctuary being consumed by fire ignited a profound realization. This was not just an attack on my barn. It was a declaration of war against anyone who dared defy them. In that moment, the true nature of the HOA was laid bare before me. A collective willing to obliterate not just wood and nails but dreams and identities for the sake of conformity. As the flames finally began to die down, I stood there in shock, watching the charred remains of my barn smolder in the afterglow. The acrid scent of burnt wood and hay filled my nostrils, a pungent reminder of what had just been destroyed. My heart pounded in my chest, a chaotic drumbeat echoing the whirlwind of emotions within me. Anger, grief, disbelief, and confusion all clashing like thunderclouds in a storm. I could see my animals, wide-eyed and trembling, seeking shelter from a chaos that had invaded their home. Buster, my loyal sheepdog, whined softly, as if he could sense my disarray. I knelt beside him, wrapping my arms around him as if I could shield both of us from the devastation. "What just happened?" I whispered into his fur, searching for answers that eluded me. The destruction reached beyond mere structure. It was a violation of everything I hold dear. My weekends spent nurturing crops and caring for animals were now overshadowed by deep-seated loss. The barn wasn't just a building. It was a repository of memories, of laughter shared with friends during harvest time and quiet moments spent with the animals during sunsets. All of that felt irreparably damaged. Confusion clouded my thoughts as I struggled to comprehend how people, neighbors I had once shared kind words with, could justify such an act of cruelty. Part of me wanted to confront them, to demand an explanation for their insanity. But another part felt paralyzed, unable to take any action amidst the swirling mix of rage and helplessness. With sirens wailing in the distance, a reminder that my two worlds were colliding, I realized I needed to channel this chaos into something more productive. The detective in me stirred from its slumber. Justice couldn't afford to wait. But first, I needed to grieve what had been lost and gather my thoughts before taking the next steps toward reclaiming not just my property but my very identity. As the embers of my barn slowly cooled and the chaos began to dissipate, I felt an unsettling energy linger in the air, a mix of disbelief and anticipation as I faced the HOA members who had orchestrated this atrocity. Their expressions, once filled with contempt, morphed into shock as they realized who I was. The realization hit them like a bolt of lightning. They had been waging war against not just a farmer but a government detective. I could see their eyes widen in astonishment, their carefully crafted facades cracking under the weight of their own ignorance. Murmurs spread among them as they exchanged glances, grappling with the implications of their actions. Just days before, they had dismissed my concerns, labeling me as an overly passionate farmer whose opinions were unworthy of consideration. Now, facing the reality that my identity carried weight and authority, their confidence faltered. "Why, you're a detective?" one of them stammered, his voice trembling slightly. The disdain that had colored their previous interactions evaporated, replaced by an urgency to recalibrate their tone. It was ironic. I had spent countless hours poring over case files and tracking down criminals, but here I was on my own property, confronting a different kind of adversary. I could feel the shift in power dynamics as I took a step closer, reclaiming my space amidst the wreckage. "Yes," I replied firmly yet calmly, allowing the weight of my position to sink in. "And you will be held accountable for what you've done today." Their faces betrayed a mix of fear and regret. The realization that I wasn't just a mere neighbor, but someone trained to navigate the complexities of law loomed large over them. This wasn't merely about property disputes anymore. It was about justice and autonomy. As I stood amidst the ashes of my barn, I understood that this moment would redefine not only how they viewed me, but how I would fight back against this tyrannical faction within our community. The initial shock of the barn's destruction began to fade, replaced by a steely resolve to seek justice. As a government detective, I had faced complex cases filled with nuances and intricacies, but now I found myself on unfamiliar terrain. Victim turned investigator. My first task was to gather evidence, not only to document the crime but to build a strong case against the HOA members responsible for this senseless act. I started by surveying the scene, taking care to note every detail. The scorch marks, remnants of personal items that survived the fire, and the scattered debris that had once been a part of my cherished barn. Each piece told a story, and I meticulously recorded everything in my notebook, ensuring I captured the full scope of the destruction. I then retrieved my camera to photograph the devastation from multiple angles. These images could serve as crucial evidence in any potential legal proceedings. Next, I reached out to neighbors who had witnessed the incident. Many appeared shaken by the flames and chaos that unfolded. Some expressed their disbelief at what the HOA had done, while others cautiously offered their support. I carefully documented their accounts, knowing that every statement could bolster my case. However, I also sensed a palpable fear among them, fear of retaliation from the HOA should they speak out too boldly. Navigating the legal complexities of this situation was daunting. I consulted with a colleague who specialized in property law. He helped me understand what kinds of charges could be pressed. As I gathered more information, it became clear that this wasn't merely a case of vandalism. It was an escalation of an ongoing dispute over community autonomy and rights. As I pieced together this puzzle, each new detail reinforced my determination to fight back. Not just for myself, but for everyone in our community whose voice had been silenced by fear. The investigation was not just about seeking justice for my barn, but about reclaiming the right to exist authentically within my own space and standing up against a system that had gone awry. As I delved deeper into my investigation, it became crucial to understand the motivations behind the HOA's extreme actions. The flamethrower incident was not an isolated outburst. It was the culmination of a long-standing feud that had been brewing beneath the surface. I began by examining the backgrounds of key HOA members, hoping to uncover personal vendettas that might explain their hostility. First, there was Marjorie, the self-appointed president of the HOA, who had often taken it upon herself to enforce rules with an iron fist. Her own house, a pristine example of suburban perfection, seemed to symbolize her desire for control over the neighborhood. I learned from neighbors that she harbored a deep-seated resentment toward anyone who challenged her authority. My efforts to beautify my property were seen as direct affronts to her vision of community standards. Then there was Gerald, a retired lawyer with a penchant for litigation. His past was filled with battles over property disputes and zoning laws, leading many to speculate he viewed our neighborhood as his personal chessboard. His disdain for my barn stemmed from more than aesthetic preferences. It was rooted in his belief that anything unconventional threatened his carefully constructed order. Finally, I discovered whispers about Sylvia, a longtime resident known for her gossiping tendencies and social alliances within the HOA. She had previously clashed with me over trivial matters, like how I kept my garden or whether my animals were too noisy, fueling a narrative among her peers that painted me as an undesirable neighbor. Connecting these dots revealed a toxic blend of jealousy, control issues, and personal grievances that pushed them to take such drastic measures against me. It wasn't just about enforcing bylaws. It was about exerting dominance over someone they perceived as different, a government detective who dared challenge their status quo. Understanding their motives fueled my resolve further. This fight wasn't just for my barn. It was a challenge against a group determined to stifle individuality and maintain their grip on power at any cost. With the evidence I had painstakingly gathered, it was time to consult legal advisors to determine my options for taking action against the HOA. Sitting across from my attorney, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The reality of pursuing legal action loomed large, but I understood that it was necessary to hold those responsible accountable for their egregious violation. My lawyer began by outlining the potential claims I could file, starting with destruction of property. The fact that they had used a flamethrower, an item not typically associated with property disputes, added a layer of severity to the case. "This isn't just vandalism. It's an attack," she emphasized, her demeanor shifting from reserved to resolute. I couldn't help but feel a surge of empowerment as she detailed how the intentionality behind their actions could lead to significant legal ramifications for the HOA. We also discussed property rights and how they pertain to what constitutes reasonable enforcement of community regulations. My lawyer explained that the HOA's authority did not extend to acts of violence or intimidation. Their rules were intended to maintain community standards, not destroy them. This clarification fueled my resolve, reaffirming that my rights as a property owner had been egregiously violated. Next, we drafted a formal complaint outlining the events leading up to the barn's destruction and detailing the impact on my life and livelihood. Filing this complaint would set in motion a series of legal proceedings that would require the HOA to respond formally. It felt like a small first step, a way to reclaim control over my narrative and stand up against abuses masked as governance. As we wrapped up our meeting, I felt both apprehensive and hopeful about what lay ahead. The road would be long and fraught with obstacles, but I was ready to navigate this new terrain as both a detective and an advocate for justice. With every document signed and every statement prepared, I was reminded that this fight was not just for me. It was for everyone in our community who felt powerless against the domineering forces that sought to suppress them. As the dust settled and the initial shock of my barn's destruction began to fade, a remarkable wave of support emerged from my neighbors and community members. Word of the incident spread like wildfire, and many gathered at my property, their faces reflecting a mix of sympathy and determination. I never expected such an outpouring of kindness, but in those momentary gatherings, I found strength amid the wreckage. The following Saturday, a group of neighbors showed up with tools in hand, offering their time and labor to help clear away the charred debris. "We couldn't just stand by after what happened," one neighbor said, handing me a shovel. "It was overwhelming to see familiar faces rally around me, ready to lend a hand without hesitation. Some brought food and drinks to keep our spirits up as we worked side by side, sharing stories and laughter amid the somber tasks at hand. As we cleared the remains of the barn together, I shared my plans for rebuilding, how I envisioned a space that would not only house my animals but also serve as a gathering place for our community. My vision inspired them, igniting hope that this tragedy could yield something beautiful. Their enthusiasm fueled my resolve, and I felt more empowered than ever to fight back against the HOA. In conversations that followed over cups of coffee on my porch or during breaks in the cleanup process, many expressed their own frustrations with the HOA. Several had faced similar battles over small infractions that had escalated unreasonably. It became clear that this struggle wasn't solely mine. It united us all against an overreaching authority that sought to strip away personal expression and individuality within our neighborhood. With each passing day, connections deepened as we worked toward rebuilding not just my barn but also our collective spirit. This experience transformed into a powerful reminder that when individuals rise against oppression together, they can create not only change but also forge stronger bonds within their community. As the time for confrontation with the HOA board approached, I felt a mixture of apprehension and determination coursing through me. With my evidence compiled and community support solidified, I knew that this meeting would be pivotal in seeking justice for my barn and restoring balance to our neighborhood. The atmosphere was charged with tension as I entered the conference room, where faces once filled with disdain now wore expressions of uncertainty. Marjorie, Gerald, and Sylvia sat at the head of the table, their typical bravado noticeably diminished. They were not just facing an angry farmer. They were confronted with a government detective who was prepared to hold them accountable for their actions. I laid out my case methodically, detailing not only the destruction of my property, but also the emotional toll it had taken on me and the broader implications for our community's autonomy. To my surprise, as tensions heightened during the exchange, there was a shift in tone from the board members. Instead of defensiveness, they began to express remorse, not just for my loss but for their roles in escalating the conflict. "We didn't realize how far we had gone," Gerald admitted, his voice wavering slightly. It seemed that as much as they had sought to control our community through fear tactics, they were now eager to avoid further damage. What followed was an unexpected negotiation. Rather than focusing solely on punitive measures against the HOA, I proposed collaborative steps toward rebuilding not just my barn but trust within our community. We discussed creating a more inclusive framework for addressing disputes, one that emphasized dialogue rather than intimidation. The idea of hosting regular community meetings to foster open communication garnered nods of agreement from the board. By the end of the meeting, we had reached an understanding. The HOA agreed to not only compensate me for my loss but also commit to changing their approach in governance. This resolution marked a turning point, not just for me but for everyone who felt marginalized by their rules. As I left the meeting, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. We had turned a page towards healing, proving that even amidst chaos, reconciliation was possible when people came together with open minds and hearts. As I reflected on the resolution reached with the HOA, a mix of satisfaction and introspection enveloped me. Justice had been served, but I couldn't shake the lingering thoughts about the nature of that justice and the personal vendetta that had nearly consumed both them and me. In my work as a government detective, justice was often a clear-cut pursuit, one guided by laws and objective truths. However, in this community conflict, emotions ran high and motives grew murky. Was seeking retribution against those who wronged me fueling my desire for justice, or was it merely an instinctive response to their aggression? The notion that we could find a compromise added depth to my understanding of community dynamics. Enforcing rules should never cross into acts of violence or intimidation. The HOA's actions were motivated by fear of losing their grip on control, fear of embracing differences within our neighborhood. Yet, in their quest for conformity, they had inadvertently ignited a firestorm that would force us all, myself included, to reconsider what it meant to belong. I pondered how law enforcement intersects with these complexities of community politics. As I navigated my own biases alongside those of the HOA members, it became apparent that true justice is not just punitive but restorative. The conversations had opened doors to dialogue that many had thought locked forever. Even though I held them accountable, I found myself reflecting on the importance of reconciliation over vendetta. My fight wasn't solely about reclaiming my barn. It had evolved into an opportunity to inspire change and build a more inclusive community while reminding everyone involved that we could disagree without resorting to violence. This journey taught me that justice can take many forms. It can be personal, communal, and ultimately transformative when approached with understanding. With each step forward, I felt not only a sense of duty to uphold the law, but also a commitment to nurturing the connections between us all as neighbors striving for harmony amidst our differences. As the sun rose over the remnants of my barn, I felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over me. The support from my neighbors had transformed this tragedy into an opportunity for growth, and I was ready to rebuild. Not just the physical structure, but also my passion for farming and community. With plans in hand and a clear vision, I gathered with friends and fellow residents to initiate the reconstruction process. We laid the foundation together, each nail driven into place symbolizing our collective resilience. This time, as we worked side by side, laughter and camaraderie filled the air, replacing the tension that had once defined our interactions. My vision for a new barn extended beyond mere functionality. It was designed to be a welcoming space for everyone, a hub where neighbors could gather for farmers markets, workshops, and community events. The incident had deepened connections within our community in ways I never expected. Many who had previously kept their distance now stepped forward to share their own stories of struggle with the HOA. Conversations flowed easily as we recounted moments of frustration and triumph over cups of coffee at my porch or during breaks on the construction site. What had begun as a conflict over property rights evolved into a collective movement toward empowerment and inclusivity. With each beam raised and wall erected, I felt my passion for farming rekindle in tandem with my commitment to justice and community advocacy. The barn soon stood proud once again, not just as a shelter for animals but as a testament to our resilience and unity against oppression. Looking around at the smiling faces of my neighbors as we completed our work, I realized that this experience had reshaped not only my relationships but also how I viewed my place in this community. Together, we had turned what could have been a bitter chapter into one filled with hope and collaboration. This journey reinforced my belief that while challenges may arise, they can ultimately lead to stronger bonds and renewed aspirations when faced together. In reflecting on my journey from loss to empowerment, I recognize the invaluable lessons learned about resilience, community dynamics, and the necessity of standing up against wrongful actions. The destruction of my barn was not just a physical loss. It was a catalyst that tested my identity and resolve as both a farmer and a government detective. This experience taught me that our identities can significantly influence conflicts and how we navigate them. What could have been a mere personal vendetta transformed into a communal rallying cry for justice. The relationships forged amid the rubble highlighted the interconnectedness of our lives. We are more than individual property owners. We are neighbors who share the same soil and aspirations. The bonding that occurred during the rebuilding phase illustrated how adversity often fosters unanticipated solidarity. When faced with an oppressive force, it is our collective voices that hold power. Through cooperation, we can challenge systems that seek to stifle individuality and enforce conformity. Moreover, this journey underscored the importance of communication in resolving disputes. The shift from confrontation to negotiation with the HOA revealed that even those who wield power can change when confronted with accountability and open dialogue. It reinforced my belief in restorative justice over retributive actions. Healing comes not from punishment, but from understanding and reconciliation. As I look to the future, I am inspired to advocate for a more inclusive community where differences are celebrated rather than suppressed. Standing firm against injustice is not merely about reclaiming what has been lost. It's about planting seeds for future growth, a thriving space where all individuals feel valued and heard. This chapter has reshaped my understanding of strength, reminding me that true resilience lies not only in personal fortitude, but also in the ability to nurture relationships that uplift us all, paving the way for a brighter future built on unity and trust.